Thank you so much for having me. This is going to be, sounds like a bit of a departure from what you all were talking about before. I am a social psychologist and study public opinion on a range of climate-related topics. And today I'll be talking about what people think about CCU and related technologies. So let's dive in. Okay. So what does the public think about CCU and CDR? Well, the data suggests that they don't. Most people have never heard of any form of carbon removal or CCU at all. Nationally representative studies on these topics are not super common, more so for carbon removal than CCU. But the ones that are out there suggest that for carbon removal, only about 20% of the public is aware of any of these approaches. They're more familiar with things like reforestation than direct air capture. But for all of them, it's around 20%. And we know that people tend to overclaim knowledge rather than underclaiming knowledge. So if anything, that's probably an overestimation. For CCU, it's even less. So it looks like CCU is more like 10% of people have ever heard of these things. So the most consistent public perception is that people have no perception at all. And that means that CCU is unlike a lot of other topics, such as climate change, where people have a lot of pre-existing beliefs. When you're coming in to try and talk to somebody about something like climate change, people have their opinions pretty set, and they're not necessarily open to new information. But for CCU in particular, this is a blank slate. So these initial descriptions of CCU that people are given, whether it's in studies or in press releases or news articles, these are going to matter a lot for how the public thinks about these technologies, for better or worse. And so the first study that I want to talk about is one that my colleagues and I ran on Americans' perceptions of CCU in particular. This was done on a nationally representative sample of 12,000 US adults, and looking at CCU. For this, we gave people brief vignette first about the process of CCU. Because people have never heard of these things, we have to first describe it before we can ask people questions about it, which gets complicated because then you want it to be super neutral so that you're not leading people. So we gave very brief general vignettes about the idea behind CCU, accompanied by this graphic on the left, and then asked them a number of questions about their support for it, their perceptions of risks and benefits, etc. We then gave them a little bit more of a vignette that talked a little bit more about some of the products that might be created, along with this graphic on the right, and asked them some more questions that were specific to the products involved. So what do people think about CCU? I'm going to start with this figure on the top left. That's people's support or opposition to using carbon capturing and utilization. So here the graph, the far left would be strong opposition, the far right would be strong support. So as you can see in that top left figure, people are generally kind of neutral to moderately supportive of CCU. They don't have a strong opinion about it, but they're kind of supportive. We see the same general pattern when we look at overall risks, overall benefits, and whether the benefits outweigh the risks, which is what each of these other figures are showing. But as you can see, for overall support and for overall benefits, we also see that this may depend a little bit on what people are, what aspect of CCU people are thinking about. So people are somewhat more supportive of CCU in general, as a general process, or for products made by captured carbon, than they are about having a local facility. So we asked them about their support for, a CCU facility being placed in their community, and they were slightly less supportive of that. Interestingly, though, we kind of expected this. People are often more supportive of technology in general than they are about things being built in their own hometown or backyard. But we thought that might be driven by perceptions of the risks. We thought people might see risks coming from local facilities. And you can see that same pattern is there for the risks, but it's not as strong and wasn't significant as it was for just not thinking there would be as many benefits. So it seems to be the benefits driving this effect rather than risks. We then also wanted to look at how do people think about the impacts of CCU for different domains? So we asked them about whether the benefits outweigh the risks when it comes to economic outcomes, climate outcomes, and health outcomes. And as you can see, there is slightly more, and this was statistically significant, thinking that the benefits would outweigh the risks more for economic outcomes and for climate and health, which were pretty neutral. So that was a little bit unexpected. We thought, the climate might be more top of mind because that's often how this is talked about. And it was certainly how it was framed in our vignette, but it seemed like the economic impacts were what were more appealing to people. We also drilled down these data that I've showed so far at the national kind of what do Americans in general think about this, but we also wanted to look at whether there are differences based on demographics or psychological variables. And what we found is that there were strong gender effects. So men were more supportive than women of CCU. They saw fewer risks and more benefits to using CCU across the board. But this was especially true when people were considering local facilities. And it was also especially true when considering economic impacts. We also found some race effects. So white respondents perceived fewer risks from CCU than Black or Hispanic respondents did. This was, again, something that we thought might happen. We thought that people of color might be more attuned to potential environmental injustices, like environmental side effects from facilities, and so might be a little bit wary about any kind of industrial process. We also looked at some psychological variables. This first one I'm going to jump into in more depth in a couple slides, but we looked at how averse people were to tampering with nature, to the idea that humans might interfere with the natural world. And as expected, we found that the more people are worried about tampering with nature, the less they tended to support CCU and the more risks versus benefits they perceived. We also looked at whether people self-identified as an environmentalist, and we found that that also predicted support. So the more that people identified as an environmentalist, the more they tended to support CCU. But I'll say this as a caveat, this was complicated by race and ethnicity. So this pattern where the more people were environmentalists, the more they supported CCU was particularly strong among our white respondents. And that was true for supporting CCU in general, for support for local facilities, and for CCU products. For Hispanic respondents, we didn't see that this effect emerge. So even Hispanic respondents who thought of themselves very much as environmentalists weren't any more supportive of CCU. And again, we don't know for sure, but we suspect this may be because the Hispanic respondents who are environmentalists are attuned not just to climate change, but to the local environmental impacts of what they fear might pop up with CCU facilities. So next, I'm going to turn to perceptions of carbon removal. And partly this is because there's really very little perceptions of CCU work that's been done. So I don't have a ton more to say about CCU, but carbon removal has had a lot more perception work on it. And for this, I want to dive into that naturalness psychological variable that I mentioned briefly, because it turns out that how natural CDR is seen to be really drives people's support for it. For this, I'm going to be drawing on two papers that my colleagues and I did looking at perceptions of CDR and the role of naturalness. So not just our work, but a lot of people's work shows that people tend to prefer processes that are seen as natural over those that are seen as unnatural. And the naturalness of various carbon removal approaches comes up a lot in discussions. It's a common way that carbon removal is categorized. And this perceived naturalness is maybe the strongest predictor of support for any given carbon removal technology. But when we started studying this, we were curious, is this something about the technology, or is this something about the person who's doing the evaluation? So is it that some types of carbon removal are seen as more natural than others, or seen as more tampering with the natural world than others? Or is it that there's some people who just generally don't like the idea of humans interfering with nature and therefore don't support technologies? Or is it some combination of the two? And when we started researching this, we realized that there actually wasn't a scale that measured people's general tendency to dislike tampering with nature. And so we had to create one. So it's just a 5-item scale that asks people things like their reactions to questions like human beings have no right to meddle with the natural environment, or I would prefer to live in a world where humans leave nature alone. And it turns out that this 5-item scale predicts support and opposition to a wide range of technologies that might be seen as tampering. So things like carbon removal, but also geoengineering, like solar geoengineering, GMOs, pesticides, cloning, gene therapy, nanoparticles. Some people have started to use it to predict support for lab-grown meat, renewable energy. It's all over the place. So anything that might be seen to tamper with nature seems to be predicted by this scale, including actual donation behavior to anti-tampering causes. So there does seem to be this general tendency that some people have to be averse to tampering with nature broadly across domains. But going back to our question about whether this tampering with nature and CDR relationship is driven by the technology or the people, we found that it's actually driven by both. So people who are generally disposed to fear tampering with nature are more likely to see various carbon removal approaches as tampering. So they're kind of on the lookout for tampering and see it more often. And they're also more likely to react negatively to these technologies when they see them as tampering. And other research has found similar patterns. So it's both about people's general tendency to be averse to tampering and their perception that any given technology tampers that matters for support. And so with carbon removal, for example, we found that people see approaches like reforestation and afforestation as more natural, and they see it as tampering less. And for other approaches like BECCS and direct air capture, those are seen as tampering more, and they're less supportive of them. And interesting, I'll note here that BECCS is seen as just as like equally tampering with nature as direct air capture, even though BECCS has this biological component, which means that it's sometimes thought of as a more natural approach to CDR. Which brings me to my next point, which is that framing matters a lot for naturalness. Other scholars have written about how the description of CDR as natural or unnatural is very arbitrary and subjective. So both lay people and experts will sometimes describe the exact same strategies as natural or as unnatural. So it's a moving target. And people will often disagree on whether something is natural or not. There's also suggestions, some experiments that have tried to describe carbon removal using analogs to natural processes, and doing so seems to boost people's support for carbon removal. So if you describe carbon removal as being like artificial trees, then people are more on board with it than if you don't use that kind of natural analogy. Same thing happens actually with solar geoengineering being described as being like volcanoes because it's natural. So naturalness matters. The last kind of theme I want to talk about is this concern that carbon removal or other technologies could cause a moral hazard. So the fear here is that if you talk about these technologies, this will make people think that there's this technology that's a silver bullet that's taking care of climate change, and we don't need to do other actions to reduce emissions. I have a number of studies that have looked at this, so I'm going to be talking broadly about some experiments that my colleagues and I have done looking at carbon removal, describing carbon removal and seeing if it reduces support for emission policies. I'll talk about one study that actually looked about solar geoengineering. So very different technology, but the psychology is the same. And a review paper that I've written about this topic. So there's kind of two directions, pathways that this could go. I prefer to use the terminology of risk compensation rather than moral hazard. Moral hazard is a term that was kind of adopted from economic descriptions of insurance, and it's, I think, not well applied here. I think risk compensation is a little bit more accurate. But the idea is that learning about carbon removal or learning about any of these kind of technologies makes people think that the risk from climate change is reduced, that this risk is taken care of by the technology, and so they don't need to be so concerned about climate change. And that this in turn reduces support for emission reductions, that if the problem is already taken care of, the risk has been reduced, we can compensate by not having to reduce emissions. That's the risk compensation hypothesis. It is also possible that people could do the opposite, what's called a risk salience hypothesis, or very clunkily sometimes called a reverse moral hazard. The idea here is that learning about these approaches makes people more aware about climate change and more concerned about it. The thought pattern being that, if we're talking about these technologies that seem so futuristic and in some cases scary, that this is that climate change must be a really big deal, maybe a bigger deal than I previously thought. So I'm really worried about it, and I want to support policies to reduce emissions even more. So either of these things could happen, or there could be no effect. And learning about these technologies could have no impact on policies. And so the layout for the way that this is usually studied in both my work and others is often done with online experiments, although there's different formats. They might be in-lab studies or phone surveys that have an experiment embedded in them. People are given some people are assigned to a control condition. That control condition might have no information about anything related to the topic, or they might get a brief description of climate change itself without any discussion of technologies. And then there's other experimental conditions that people might be randomly assigned to, where they read not just about climate change, but about CDR in general, or about particular technologies. So this one example that I'm showing you here is from Campbell-Arvai et al., where we looked at climate change control, climate change plus general process of carbon removal, or climate change plus either reforestation, BECCS, or direct air capture. And then after participants had read about this information, we asked them about their beliefs about climate change, their beliefs about the technologies, and their support for emissions. So in some of our work, we do find evidence for risk compensation or moral hazard. So this first study, we found that when people were assigned to read about carbon removal in general, BECCS, or direct air capture, they had lower risk perceptions afterwards about climate change. So they were less worried about the risk from climate change after reading about these technologies than they were in the control condition. And that this in turn lowered people's support for emission reduction policies. We found this was especially true for political conservatives who were less supportive of the policies to start with. Democrats and liberals kind of supported it no matter what condition they were in. So some evidence initially for this moral hazard. But in other research, the exact same team using slightly different processes didn't quite replicate this effect. We found here tiny or null moral hazard effects. And it seems that these minute tweaks to the study it designed affect the results. The fact that people had never heard of these technologies means that the initial ways they are described in these studies really affects how people think about them. And so while we found a slight moral hazard effect in that second study, in one study we found it in that paper, and in others we didn't. So we don't always replicate our own effects. And to get to the point about how this minute framing makes a difference, I'm going to talk about a study about solar geoengineering that directly tried to manipulate the framing to see if this is what's causing the difference. So in this one, we looked at the exact same technology here. We didn't look at different types of solar geoengineering. It was the technology that was described was kept the same, but we changed how it was talked about. So we had our climate change only control, and then we had one condition where people were told about climate change and solar geoengineering, but it was described as a major solution, so kind of a silver bullet kind of framing. And we had another condition where people were told about solar geoengineering, but it was described as at most a minor solution, like a piece of the puzzle potentially. And then we looked at support for policies after that. And we found again that talking about solar geoengineering can undermine support for mitigation. And again, this is especially for political conservatives, but here only if it was described as a silver bullet. If it was described as just maybe a piece of the puzzle, but not going to take care of the whole problem, we didn't see a significant moral hazard effect pop up. So this is about framing, I would argue. Other research by other teams has found that reading about solar geoengineering can actually have risk salience effects. So people end up supporting policies more after reading about solar geoengineering in some of those studies. But the most common finding is null effects. So most common research looking at carbon removal or solar geoengineering finds that reading about these technologies has no impact on emission reduction support. Overall, these effects are very small and they tend to hover on either side of zero. So they're susceptible to tiny changes in how these technologies are described. And this leads me to say that where moral hazard effects pop up, they are the result of framing rather than something about the technology. So if to the extent that moral hazard is a concern, I argue that it's a communication concern. It's not something that is always going to happen with these technologies. Certainly, there are bad actors who could go out and use these as excuses not to reduce emissions, and that is a real concern. But again, that's about how they're communicating about those. It's not something that's always going to happen if these technologies are used. I'll also say that for all of these results, these technologies in people's minds are fairly hypothetical because most people have never heard of them. They're kind of reacting to it in a hypothetical, abstract way. I think in a future, if and when these kind of technologies are used kind of at scale in a way that people are more aware of and deployed, people's perceptions are likely going to change, and the factors that affect support are going to be different in a world where they're seeing it in real time than when it's abstract. So to sum up, what does the public think about CCU and CDR? Well, they don't, but when they do, framing matters. So whether these technologies are perceived as natural is affected by how these technologies are framed. Whether moral hazard effects show up depends on how these technologies are framed. Identity also matters. So women and people of color are more wary of CCU, and environmentalists, at least white environmentalists, are more supportive of CCU. And finally, location matters. So abstract ideas about CCU in general or products seem to be more palatable to people than the idea of local facilities. So with that, I'll stop and thank my colleagues and my sponsors, especially the CO2 initiative, and happy to take questions.